Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us this evening. Tim, thanks very much for joining us this evening. I didn't know whether to assure you you would be amongst a friendly audience or whether you've just walked into the Lion's Den. So welcome to this very friendly Lion's Den, Tim. It's fantastic to have you with us.
I enjoyed the case for the prosecution.
But I think before I talk to you about your project, the Good Right, and your recent critique, it's a matter of coincidence that the Conservative Party launched their manifesto earlier this morning. I think it was coincidence. I don't think they delayed it just to make sure that this event coincided with their manifesto launch. What's your take on it? I mean, they seem to be using your language already. This is the Evening Standard from earlier today. So Cameron is pledging a good life for Britons. Excellent stuff. It probably wouldn't be such good coverage if he was pledging a bad life for Britons. So he agrees with your broad marketing approach. But what do you think? You impressed, inspired, infused, the sort of Conservative recipe that you were hoping and dreaming for?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Mark. And the reason I wanted to come is because, and I should say, I welcome Stephen Shakespeare at the back there as well, who is co-conspirator and partly responsible for the Good Right. The reason why we launched the Good Right in draft form before we produced the book is we wanted to engage in events like this because we wanted people on the right to feel comfortable with what we're doing. And it's clear that Philip and Ryan and some people at the IA aren't. And so having this conversation is valuable, and I hope I can learn stuff from you tonight as well as hopefully vice versa. But to answer your question, having dodged it so far as a politician, I think the Tory manifesto was interesting today. I thought we saw the return of that early optimistic David Cameron when he first became Tory leader. I think one of his most memorable catchphrases was "Let sunshine win the day." Not to everyone's liking, that catchphrase, but that's where he stood as an optimistic Tory. And today we got optimism in spades. And the interesting thing was, after having made larger cuts in public spending than Margaret Thatcher ever made during the last 5 years, he was making bigger spending pledges than Ed Miliband. And so you saw, Labour promised 2.5 billion extra for the National Health Service. David Cameron is promising 8 billion. Labour are promising 25 hours free childcare. The Tories are promising 30.
Is this great politics or great policy?
Well, I think it's a sign that the Tories are nervous about the election result. I don't think they'd be making these promises if they thought the election was in the bag. It's different from 6 months ago when David Cameron was saying the red lights are flashing on the dashboard of the world economy. It's different from a little while ago when the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, was saying that deeper spending cuts are likely in the next 2 years than any that have been made in the previous 5. So I think if the opinion polls are accurate, and I have to say in deference to Stephen, of course they are, the current position is not where David Cameron needs them to be. If the opinion polls don't move, there'll be more Labour and SNP MPs after polling day than Tory and Lib Dem MPs, and he has to worry about that. Linton Crosby, the Australian campaign guru, thought the opinion polls would have moved by now. They haven't. And so I think the Tories are the ones that need to change the weather. And I think we saw today a manifesto that took risks. There wasn't the same message we've had up until now. And I think the Tories are probably promising more than they're comfortable with.
In terms of spending?
In terms of spending. And this over £20 billion now of unfunded spending pledges, which the party used to be against. That was one of George Osborne's big conflicts with the right, if you remember, nearly 10 years ago. The right wanted what he called unfunded tax cuts, and he disavowed them. But there's plenty of unfunded spending pledges and unfunded tax cuts in today's manifesto.
Okay, well that was quite upbeat. What was the part of the Conservative manifesto that you liked the least?
Well, I worry about, I've tried to describe what the manifesto included. I do worry about the unfunded commitments. I think that would be the main thing I worry about. I don't like the childcare policy. I much prefer what we're seeing with the Canadian Conservatives, where they're giving tax cuts to allow families to choose how to organise their own affairs, rather than subsidising everybody going out to work through childcare. That, more than anything else, was was probably the policy I didn't like.
Okay, let's move on to...
And I agree with the IEA, deregulate the supply
Right.
of China. If I can begin on a note of
Great.
consensus
We
before
will
all the trouble starts.
We will be returning to that note of consensus, albeit probably fleetingly. Your own proposition, the good right. I rewatched this afternoon the piece that you did for the Daily Politics, sort of outlining your broad themes where you thought Conservatives should stand, and you begin by standing by the Ronald Reagan statue, saying that Reagan said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language were I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And then you point out, but my fellow Conservatives, that was meant as a joke. And clearly it was meant as a joke. I'm from the government and I'm here to murder you is a more chilling statement than I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And you go on in that piece to say that sort of you characterise politics as the sort of big left, big government, huge state intervention on the one side. You're standing to the left-hand side of camera, as you say this, and on the other side there's the sort of sink and swim libertarians, and the Conservatives should stand somewhere in the middle. You actually say Conservatives should stand in the middle. Can you flesh out what your real proposition is here, and if you like, what your critique is of what you think those on the right have got wrong to date?
Yeah, I think in essence, probably the most important contention that we make is that the government is not the enemy. And I believe that the government has all sorts of functions in society, and I suspect most of us in this room agree that the government has all sorts of functions in society. Not least is redistribution. Margaret Thatcher redistributed, Ronald Reagan redistributed, Stephen Harper does, Tony Abbott does, David Cameron does. But we somehow give the impression that we're against it, those of us on the right. We never have a good word to say about government, even though, of course, if we were all asked to list some government functions, we would all list some more than, some of us perhaps more than others. But giving the impression in every press release that we send out, every utterance that we are against government, I think frightens a lot of voters. And I'm not a big government conservative, I'm a small government conservative. I agree with the analysis, and I quoted it many times, Mark, your analysis that the British state in the last 50 years has struggled to raise much more than 36 to 38% of GDP in taxes. And I think as global competition increases, intensifies, it may well be that that's a ceiling that will fall in the years to come. It may be harder for governments even to sustain that level of tax. So we have to keep downward pressure on government, and it is what I think libertarians offer most to the Conservative family, is to keep worrying about state spending and its problems. But we do need a theory of the state. We need to know what we're in favour of, because if we give the impression that we only see problems in the state, that everything the state does is kind of wrong or somehow resented, then don't be surprised that in a nation which, according to YouGov, 67% want more government spending, people start to reject us. Mm-hmm. Because David Cameron is very wise, I think, in his manifesto, and he said it again today, to say that people want security more than they want freedom. Freedom is an incredibly important thing, of course it is, but actually providing security for people matters too. People don't want to be left on their own, and if we give the impression that we are a sink or swim philosophy, we shouldn't be surprised that the Conservatives haven't won a general election since 1992. And the same on the other side of the Atlantic. The Republicans have stopped winning presidential elections.
No, I can remember when we heard your critique, that's sort of saying 90% of IEA press releases are slamming the government action here, there, or everywhere. I went completely ballistic. I went straight to Steph Litt and said, "What the hell are the other 10% of press releases about?" God blimey! I said, we haven't really got a very consistent PR approach there. And I was reading earlier, you pointed out, the Conservatives, so if you like, share of the vote has declined. I mean, this is true of mainstream parties as smaller parties have arisen. The American Republican Party hasn't done brilliantly well in recent years. My favourite little electoral nugget that I discovered the day before yesterday was that, in fact, the US Republican Party haven't won a presidential election without a Bush or Nixon on the ticket since 1928. So that might inform who they pick this time. But what I wanted to ask you is, and this is going to form, I think, a lot of the questions I put to you. How much of this is a matter of presentation or marketing or a tone of voice and, you know, colour schemes, background music, you know, us coming across as nasty in our press releases? Or how much is it a matter of policy? And Philip said in his opening remarks that sort of the good right, I know that's been controversial, of course. Theresa May got in trouble some years ago for using exactly, you know, we are the nasty party, and this was considered to be too much an admission. But in terms of, is it a marketing approach? Is your critique that we come across as too nasty? And in terms of the name that you've selected for the project, I know that Guy Herbert, who's in the audience, wanted to raise a question about whether that was a helpful way to try and change the narrative. Guy, we can just wait for the microphone to get to you. That would be perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Regardless of the merits or demerits of your values and your policies, and I think there are both, I was wondering about this branding. You're not naive in coming to this. You had obviously a deliberate choice, but the good right has two immediately apparent problems to me. One is that claim we're all attempting, almost everybody in the world attempts to live a good life, to be a good person, but claims to have an answer and a direct line to what is the good have a very, very bad history, particularly in politics. And secondly, the good right seems to be buying into a popular narrative espoused by people on the left who think they have the sole source of moral authority and good, that the right is made up of rotters. And the good right doesn't appear to me to sell to either group. Who are you selling to?
Okay. Thank you, Guy. Well, it's a controversial name, and I appreciate that. And I know you on Twitter and other people have reacted strongly to it. But you know, there is an element in which we want to create a debate, and you choose a name that helps you get noticed rather than ignored. George W. Bush, of course, had this criticism when he proposed compassionate conservatism, you know, circa 2000. And people said, well, are you saying that the rest of conservatism isn't compassionate? And I think the same motivation is behind what we're trying to do. And whether we like it or not, in my experience when I go around to conservative associations, when I speak to gatherings like this, is that, you know, most of us are motivated to exactly the same moral principles and benefit of people as people on the left. I don't think there is a fundamental difference between, you know, what's in the hearts of people on the left and the right who are most active in politics and free markets. But the reality is that voters out there don't think that the right has the interest of most people at heart. And that isn't a marginal thing. The polling is overwhelming that we are the party of the rich, or a movement of the rich, however you want to describe it, that we are more selfish and less community-minded than the left. And this may be unfair, we may resent it, but it's a big problem. And it, of course, has been a historical problem. Churchill, you know, said if you're a socialist at 20, you haven't got a heart, and if you're still a socialist at 40, you haven't got a brain. I don't think he was the first person to say that, but he certainly popularised it. There's a deep feeling amongst lots of people. We saw it with Martin Freeman, the Hobbit actor, in his broadcast for the Labour Party in this election. Just a simple assumption. He was on the left because the left cared. And so I think we do, as a matter of a basic operating principle, need to work incredibly hard at changing that perception. And I think it matters more today than it used to, because in a relatively affluent electorate and relatively affluent times, people are more interested in voting their values than perhaps they were in the past. And you see it again and again. When there are tough times, people come back to nurse for fear of something worse. They embrace the Tories, they embrace the right, because they want they know the grown-ups kind of need to be in charge. But in good times, they they go left again, because the Labour Party and the left are trusted with good times. They build the good society. And we have to change that, because otherwise, when good times roll and there's money to spend, it's not centre-right parties, free market parties that hold office.
So can I just follow up on that point? To what extent, and I'm going to come to policy in a minute, but to what extent are you saying that this is essentially a matter of presentation? Here is your Good Right logo with a kind of cool pair of Doc Martin boots, some ballet shoes, a pen and a skateboard, in sharp contrast to our rather austere IEA logo, the Institute of Economic Affairs. I mean, are you saying that a big part of this is, I don't know, we should rename ourselves the Institute for Poverty Relief rather than the Institute of Economic Affairs, that we should, we should have a rainbow as our logo rather than, just being black and red? Is this a kind of marketing point that you're making, which I'm not diminishing it if it is, that the language and colour schemes and branding that people use in expressing their arguments and the precise way they express them is hugely important in winning the debate? Is that the substance of what you're saying, or to what extent is the substance we've got policies wrong?
Yeah, it is both. And I'm glad you said that, acknowledge marketing is not unimportant. Marketing is incredibly important, and I think it matters how you present exactly the same policy. You can cut the deficit to appease international money markets. You can cut the deficit because you shouldn't spend more money than you earn, or you can cut the deficit because it's the only way of putting health and social services and the safety net on a sustainable basis. You can sell exactly the same policy in different ways and to more effective ways. Just one example of why I think presentation matters. But substantially, I think you say you're coming on to policy, but substantially, I think we need to rethink some of our instincts as well. And the logo that you refer to, a lot of it is chopped off, but it's is the debate, which I think most people would currently understand it in Britain, is that to be crude, Labour's the party of the state and the Conservatives are the party of the market. And the Tories basically want to cut the size of the state, and the Labour Party want to increase the size of the state. I would say, and what the Good Right is trying to recommend, is that things are more complicated than that. And actually the basis of a good society are work, which is the idea of the pot with all the tools in, family, which is the selection of shoes, and then education. Now, I would say that where Conservatives need to position themselves in is that the basis of a good society, the three agents of society, the most important agents of society, are job creators, parents, and teachers, educators. And what role do we have in making those three succeed? Okay. Do we let them just on their own, or do actually we need to get behind them in some way?
Okay. Let's go through some policy areas then. Housing. I've gone through your list of sort of 12 ideas, your initial sort of draft list.
And can I emphasise again, they are a draft list, and they were deliberately draft, not because we're sort of afraid of running away from them, but we're sure they could be.
Great, I would be delighted if you delete some of them and cut and paste in the IEA's proposals. If it's still in draft form, then this is a very timely meeting. So, I mean, a property owning democracy, all of the, this is a shared aspiration. But in housing, what do you think the role of the state is in housing? Do you think it has a comparative advantage in being a major construction industry? I think my statistics are a year or so out of date, but certainly a year or so ago, and I have no reason to believe it's changed. We in the UK have the second highest proportion of social housing in Europe, about 20% or so of the stock. Austria is a little ahead of that. Many other countries, it's near as damn it 0%. What do you think the state's role is in the housing issue?
Yeah. Well, we need to be building about 300,000 homes a year as a nation. Some say 250,000 if you controlled immigration more tightly, but putting that aside, we need to be building a lot more houses than we are. And if you look at the post-war graph for house building, the private sector has largely been building pretty much the same amount during all of that period. What has collapsed since the 1980s is state building of houses. I support the right to buy, as Margaret Thatcher introduced it. I support the right to buy that's being outlined in today's Tory manifesto. But I think that housing stock needs to be replenished. And the Adam Smith Institute today, in their reaction to the manifesto, say just declassifying 0.5% of green belt could provide the sort of house building that we would need for a decade to increase supply. I'm suspicious that as much as deregulation is needed in the housing market, that would be enough for all sorts of reasons. One of which is the development sector in the UK now is quite oligopolistic. I think I've pronounced that right, despite a glass of wine. And there isn't the skills in the housing market. They have got a development model which relies on a certain price. And I think if you look at the Ebbsfleet Newtown development, you look at the, where's the other one in near Oxfordshire, it's required some state money in infrastructure to get these things going. I think the state could make a profit from house building, or certainly providing infrastructure for these housing. But I think just relying on the market alone to solve this problem, I think is unlikely.
We've done a lot.
And just one final thing, sorry, just to add, the state is involved in this sector enormously already. We're spending as taxpayers £25 billion on housing benefit, picking up the pieces from a broken sector. One of the big reasons why the welfare budget is as big as it is now compared to 5 years ago is the housing benefit bill has risen
the cost of living's gone up.
Much beyond expectation. So the state's involved. It's just a question of how do you want the state to be involved? Okay. At the top of the stream or at the bottom of the stream?
Okay, we've done a lot of work here, and I'd like to throw to Christian Niemitz, our key researcher in this area, that overwhelmingly this is a supply side problem. I'm glad that, we're arguing here about, if you like, who should build the houses rather than whether we should put all of our efforts into subsidising people getting onto the ladder of the present housing stock. But I wonder if I can throw to Christian, who's done a lot of work in this area, and I think has a confidence that if you liberalise, then actually the market can basically crack this problem. Christian.
Yes, thank you. Tim, you said that the private sector has built more or less the same amount of housing throughout the post-war decades, and that may be true here, but clearly in most of the developed world, housing is predominantly a private sector activity. In most comparable countries, state housing is at best a hangover from the 1960s, 70s. If that, there are places like Switzerland where the state has never been much involved in housing. And that's why you would have a hard time finding any economist who agrees with the idea that only the state can build houses, or only the state can build sufficient quantities of houses. Most of the literature is quite clear that it's all about how easy you make it to obtain permission to develop. And the oligopolistic housing market structure that you mentioned, that is itself a consequence of those supply-side constraints. Because once you've driven up the price of land to the levels that we have now, then of course only very big firms can operate in this market at all, because you're driving up the fixed costs. That's what has driven out self-builders and small companies. So my question is then, why don't you spend a lot more time attacking the supply-side constraints that we have, and perhaps even more importantly, the vested interests, the people who make it near impossible to get anything built? Because clearly if you want to show that free marketeers are on the side of the little guy, then that would be the best way to start, because it's essentially a policy that protects landed wealth.
Yeah. Well, look, Christian, I think I would agree with a large part of what you say, and I certainly support deregulation, and as I mentioned to Mark already, the ASI statistic is compelling. One of the reasons why, the most important thing that we need to achieve with house building is we need to make house building popular. The worst thing would be if we'd have a splurge of housing. Nick Boys-Smith makes this case with create streets. And the argument, the most dangerous thing would be we built a lot of houses, they were ugly, they didn't have enough infrastructure around them, and it would sort of re-toxify house building. If there is a way of deregulating the housing market and the private sector stepping forward to invest properly in the quality of housing, beauty of housing. Beauty is an incredibly important concept in the housing market and for the right generally. Aesthetics, I think we neglect. I'm not talking about the IEA logo now, but we neglect that. And infrastructure to support it. If that could all be delivered by the private sector, then I would sign up to your manifesto immediately. And that, of course, is what Simon Wolfson tried to achieve with his Garden City Prize. You know, the rule of it was that there would be no state money involved in these projections, and you know, his argument was that when you reclassify the land from farmland to being buildable upon, you know, the value of that land can increase in the southeast of England, you know, by 100 times, sometimes more, which produces the kind of money which you can invest in infrastructure with, you can buy off local NIMBYs, all the rest of it. I just wonder whether there would be too much inertia and vested interests for that to happen smoothly without the state pump priming those projects. And having sat round the table twice with the candidates for that prize and asked them this question, they did think that while it was possible that it could happen without state money, state investment of which the taxpayer could make a big profit on in the years ahead would certainly help the process accelerate and more likely to happen.
But then, why, if you like, why do you think that is the case? Because, I mean, if you are a generally, you know, pro-capitalist, pro-market conservative, why would you think that the state is likely, let's say, to get the aesthetics better than a company that relies on actually selling this and its profit return will be based on whether people like the aesthetics or not? The record to date is pretty horrific. I live in ex state built, but you know, ex local authority housing. It looks absolutely ghastly from the outside. Thankfully, Margaret Thatcher sold it all off, so it's now got nice gardens and security, and the carpets in the communal hallways are nice, and during it they can just sort of paint over this ghastly concrete monstrosity that the state determined would be a wonderful community for us all to live in the 1950s or the 1960s. I mean, my, if you like, initial assumption is I wouldn't trust the state on aesthetics. And right next door to me, I mean, it is almost an identical twin sort of comparison, is an almost identical building which has not been sold off and is bloody awful. I mean, it's graffiti all over the place, the crime rate's high, hardly any owner-occupiers there. It seems to me that unleashing the market there has improved the block that I'm in, aesthetically and in terms of safety. And the state's initial design was ghastly. And on the watch of the bureaucracy, it has not improved the next door block. Why not trust the market here, at least as your starting position?
Well, if you look at a lot of private sector development in the 50s, 60s and 70s, you know, it was as ugly as anything that the state constructed. And I think, you know, this is the role still for some sort of planning permission. I think you can trust communities to come up with the kind of design configuration that they want. But I'm less, probably maybe haven't communicated this entirely adequately, but I'm less concerned about the private sector's inability to provide beautiful houses. I'm more worried about whether private sector developments provide the adequate infrastructure that people want. And that, you know, top of the concerns about why NIMBYs don't like property being built in their backyard is the sense that they will be overwhelmed with, you know, the local schools, the local roads, the local GP surgery won't be able to cope. So the state's first role in making sure developments happen is to at least underwrite that infrastructure support. It doesn't have to get absolutely involved in detailed specification about what a house should look like, and there we may agree, but it does need to enable and encourage a certain level of beauty. Otherwise, we'll get all sorts of ugly rabbit hutch houses built very quickly, which in 3 or 4 years' time will have been completely counterproductive.
Let me move on to the labour market and where you see a role for the state here. again, your draft proposal is to have above inflation increases in the minimum wage until or unless the effect on unemployment became obvious. Do you accept a priori that increasing the minimum wage is likely to lead to jobs not being created? That if you put up the price of anything, you are likely to lower the demand for it? Is that your starting position?
Absolutely, yeah. But on this stage, James Bartholomew's book launch last week, we had Lord Freud stand more or less where you're now sat and said, we are almost at full employment in the UK at the moment, is that we are close to the level of vacancies and the level of being more or less equivalent. And what we are having, I think, is a very distorted labour market at the moment, where you have massive subsidy by the state of wages, and there was a report in the Sunday Times that sort of confirmed this at the weekend. That many of these supermarkets are now paying less in tax to the government than they're getting back in wage subsidy. So I think there is room to increase the minimum wage year on year and examine the impact, because ideally we should want the state to be spending money on infrastructure, on support house building, support universities, support science, whatever. Those are the best uses. Some may not think that that's a good use for the state at all, but if you're going to be spending, if the state has a role, and I think one of the things the right has neglected is a theory of the state. If the state's going to be having a role, I'd much rather it was spending on those sorts of things I've just outlined than subsidising wages.
Right, but
that's a much better way of the state helping industry than what it's currently doing,
but
and reinforcing Britain's productivity problem.
Right, but I want to pick you up on this and cross-examine you on it, because definitely the left-wing critique is, this is Tesco's are having their low wages subsidised. What an outrage. I mean, is that really the question? Or aren't the wages actually reflecting the productivity of the workforce? Mm-hmm. So if your productivity is £8 per hour, stacking shelves or doing whatever you do in Tesco's, and the state, in its wisdom, decides that everyone needs to be on £12 an hour, well, that's not Tesco's problem. I mean, you should be subsidising £8 per hour wages if the government itself has deemed that everyone, for reasons of human rights or whatever, needs to earn above their productivity. What is your evidence to suggest that these low wages are not a fair assessment of the productivity of the labour force? And if the democratically elected government wants to go and subsidise low wages, they're subsidising the workers. They are not subsidising Tesco's.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, first of all, I'm certainly not proposing a jump from anything like £8 to £12 overnight. It would have to be incremental. It would have to be studied. If you enforce something like a jump from the minimum wage to the living wage, you'd be asking for problems. I'm asking for a judicial, careful study of putting up the minimum wage and examining its implications, and we can find out whether you're largely right or whether I'm largely right. The predictions that lots of Conservatives made in 1997 when Labour proposed the minimum wage was large-scale unemployment may result. And in some areas, I think in youth unemployment, it has had some negative effects. So I'm not saying that, I'm not a complete convert to a sort of cavalier minimum wage, and there may be cases for certain exemptions, certain regional flexibilities, certain sectoral flexibilities. We might actually be wiser to have some sort of wages council system rather than a minimum wage which is one size fits all. But we also should acknowledge on the right that it didn't have the big impact on unemployment that we thought, because a system was put in place whereby employers and small businesses as well as large business came together to study the impact of the minimum wage, and that on that basis it should proceed. And I think the fundamental answer to your question is, if that pressure is put on firms slowly, gently, year after year, perhaps they might just invest a little bit more in the skills of their workforce. One of the reasons why Britain has such a low productivity workforce is, compared to other countries, our employers, our businesses invest less in their training of the workforce. Right. Perhaps if within a slightly tighter wage regime, they would consider more about addressing the productivity problem that this economy has.
Well, that might be true if you set up, just in terms of the impact of the minimum wage when introduced. And there's an interesting article in a previous issue of our magazine, EA, that looks at this. I'm not totally sure exactly who said this is going to sort of lead to 2 million people being thrown out of work overnight. I mean, that spectre has been raised. I mean, I don't remember the IEA predicting that.
I certainly remember Tory politicians.
Well, more fool them. I think the problem is much more, and this is a problem that I think free marketeers face a lot. The problem is an unseen problem. It's not that the employer says, oh, right, I was willing to pay you £6 an hour, but now the government insists I pay you £6.10. I'm going to immediately fire you on the spot. They would tend to actually accommodate that. Okay, I hadn't quite worked out whether you're worth £6 or £6.20. If I've got to pay you £6.10, you know, and I'll avoid an industrial tribunal and an employment tribunal, I'll pay it. But you surely become a little less likely to create a new job. You know, this is an additional cost on business. So, right, I'll pay, you know, Mrs. Miggins an extra 20p and Mr. Smith an extra 20p, but I'm not going to increase my workforce to the third person. So there seems to be a time lag effect. It's not that everybody below the minimum wage was immediately made redundant, clearly not. But what we saw in the upswing in youth unemployment, I mean, catastrophic numbers, starting to hit continental European numbers, seemed to me to be evidence that we weren't creating the new jobs that these people could come in and take. So it's difficult, I think, that the test shouldn't be, are employers immediately throwing low-paid people out of work? They'll try and adapt. But there has to be a worry that they're not creating new jobs that otherwise would have been created. But nearly impossible to prove. That's an a priori case.
But maybe I can ask you a question, Mark. You know, the job creation performance of the UK economy at the moment is exceptional, absolutely exceptional. And we don't have a job creation problem, really, as you know, Lord Freud was suggesting. What we have is a low pay problem. We have a problem of the state spending money that the country doesn't really have, subsidising employers who aren't investing in their workforces. I think it's at least arguable that we should, just as the state allowed the minimum wage to fall in real terms when the recession struck, to give employers breathing space during difficult times, to push it the other way for a period and just see whether actually our businesses can be encouraged.
But then what would be your sort of cut-off point on that? I mean, again, to reduce this to absurdity, I mean, if we brought in a rule to say that the minimum wage is £100 an hour, you could be certain that everybody left in employment would be pretty goddamn super productive, right? And you could be pretty certain that if someone was on £95 an hour, the employer said, well, we just need to top you up to £100 an hour. But you could also be certain that that would destroy vast numbers of jobs. Very few people have that level of productivity. But again, why are you putting the burden on the employer to say your job is to improve the productivity of your workforce, rather than that being the employee's responsibility while they're going through education or vocational training? Or that actually, rather than the money being used on enhanced wages, perhaps it should be paid out in dividends. That money might then well be used to pay for your grandchildren's education and improve their productivity. Why the fixation on the rate of return to labour, and why the suggestion that there's an obligation on the employer to make sure that the people who are walking in through the door and applying for a job are productive?
Well, I noticed you completely didn't answer my question. You immediately went from me asking for a very judicious policy in your reaction to that, you went off to the absurdity of, and to use your word, of £100 wage, which is fine.
Well, I mean, I think it works like prices or anything else. I think if you put the price of a Mars bar up a penny, you won't see the complete destruction of the Mars bar industry, but you will see a modest fall in demand for Mars bars, all things being equal.
Which would be a problem if we weren't basically at full employment of the equivalent of,
and I think our problem
the Mars bar industry.
And I agree with you, productivity is the problem. That's why I'm now worried about jacking it up, because I think we've been good at low productive job creation.
Yeah, these of course aren't either ors. Of course, you know, there should be private sector and government provided solutions to individual productivity. There's all sorts of evening courses that can be provided by the private sector. There's training programs that can be provided by the government for people moving between jobs. There's all sorts of opportunities for the state to provide the nation with a second chance, reskilling opportunities. But I think there's still a case to encourage British employers to think, why are their workers? Why do they spend so little on their workers compared to other countries in Europe and not so much America, but certainly in Europe? And I think there are advantages for employers to have better paid, better skilled, happier workforces in terms of their stability, the time that they spend with that employer, with their happiness, their tiredness. And I wonder whether some of our, assuming that every employer is a rational maximizer, is an assumption that many on the right make, and I think it's a very flawed assumption.
I don't make that. I just think they're more rational than the state.
They are more rational than many in the state, but I think the state sometimes, which is why I'm not against the state in every sense, the state has responsibilities to focus on the long term that some in the business community don't necessarily focus.
Just on this, what we would call at the IEA price fixing. Right?
Yeah.
You're saying the government has a role in fixing the price of labour. It seems to me the Conservative Party has said that the fixing of energy prices is a ludicrous, economically illiterate piece of socialism, but the fixing of rail prices is a prudential, sensible, conservative move in order to encourage travel and transport. And I think you welcomed the policy on rail fares, at least as good politics. Again, good politics or good policy or both?
Yeah, also helped write the Times leader on Saturday, which made exactly the point that you did. There's no fundamental difference between fixing energy prices and fixing rail prices. So lots of things, are good politics, and I think the rail fare freeze is undoubtedly good politics, as the energy policy was when Ed Miliband announced it at his party conference. It moved the opinion polls. Not many things move opinion polls.
But I mean, if a politician get away with saying my policy is to halve all prices and double all salaries, that might be very good politics, but it would clearly be appalling economics.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think that in a country with full employment, it is necessarily, or even I think it's worth allowing the minimum wage to begin to rise a little bit above inflation and just to judge its impact.
Philip, I think, did want to come back on the price fixing point.
Well, I was specifically going to ask about rail fares, but in a sense you've dealt with that. I think I read the Times leader actually, which was a good leader, and you sort of disowned that policy philosophically, even if you still regard it as good practical politics. But maybe I can relate that back to the issue you said earlier when you said the right often doesn't have a good theory of the state. Actually, there are lots of theories of the state kicking around the right, ranging from anarcho-capitalism, complete anarchy, to sort of Hayekian conservatism and a few other things. And I'm wondering, what is your theory of the state which leads you, for example, to be in favour of price fixing in labour markets but against price fixing in energy markets, or for that matter, lead you to choose any one policy over an alternative policy?
My basic theory of the state is the one enshrined in the logo, which is that the most important agency in society to look after people isn't the welfare state. I think Conservatives should support a safety net. I think people on the free market should support a safety net. Winston Churchill said Conservatives mustn't just be the party of the ladder, they must be the party of provide the finest social ambulance service in the world. So there is a role for welfare, but it shouldn't be a central role. I think we should try and minimise it for all able-bodied people. My theory of the state is that the three most important agents are job creators, educators and parents. Do you leave them on their own to sink or swim, or do you try and help those to succeed? Do you provide a minimum education for everyone through the state? Do you provide the opportunity to reskill in your 30s or 40s if for whatever reason you've been in prison or had a drug problem or whatever? On the family, do you create a tax system that recognises marriage, or do you have a tax system that encourages childcare? On job creation, do you provide the kind of infrastructure that can help firms succeed and compete in the modern world? In all of those areas, I think the state has a bigger role than perhaps some of the more libertarian theories of the state.
Can I pick that up then, Tim? In terms of the There's two areas I want to ask you about. One's the scope of the state, and I distinguish that from the size of the state.
Yeah.
So, to look at its scope, where do you think state provision is a comparative advantage against market provision? This isn't to say that you shouldn't guarantee access. I mean, so, at the moment, we've sort of stumbled across the apparent consensus in British politics that we will rely on profit-making supermarkets to provide food, but we will rely on state-run hospitals to provide healthcare. The implication, indeed the only logical conclusion, can be that the consensus believes that the state doesn't have a comparative advantage in providing food, but it does have a comparative advantage in providing healthcare. Why or where do you see a role in the state providing the service rather than guaranteeing access? We try to have a policy to make sure everybody can eat, but that doesn't mean that we nationalise Tesco's and Walmart. Why don't we take the same approach to healthcare? We'll make sure everybody has a voucher, we'll make sure everybody has an education voucher, but why would Whitehall be the best providers of that good or service?
Well, let me answer this question, and you can come back to me if you don't think I've answered it correctly, with a really important philosophical difference. Is Ryan born here?
No, he's in Mexico. Oh, right, okay. He's fled to a low-tax jurisdiction.
Well, I hope I hope I represent him correctly then, but in this. But you have to start where you are. So, if you've got some sort of state-provided healthcare system, and you have some sort of private-provided supermarket system, well, that's where you have to start. The question is, if you want a slightly smaller state, what do you do? Do you just cut back the supply, which is what generally I think the right have done for a long time? There's just focusing, the state is spending too much money, taxes are too high, the state is inefficient, let's reduce its scope and the services that it provides. Or do you think about how you reduce the demand for government? Do you approach it from the other side of the equation? So you could apply that to the minimum wage discussion that we've just been having. Is the right response to reduce the amount of state provision for, say, tax credits? Just say we're not going to provide any more tax credits for business anymore and let the wage settle to their level? Or do you try and reduce the demand for the state by increasing the minimum wage? Do you just cut benefits?
Let me
finish.
In the mind game I'm giving you, we're going to continue to have exactly the same amount of state spending on healthcare, right? Exactly the same amount. I'll come to the size in a moment. In terms of scope, however, pick whatever the NHS budget is now, I'm going to spend exactly the same to the penny, right? I'm not going to cut it for the sake of argument, but I'm just suggesting the dispersal of those funds should be dispersed by the mechanism of a health voucher of some sort or a guaranteed insurance policy. Not that the state should recruit nurses and brain surgeons and the like. So I'm not suggesting a single cut at this stage, just that we would get out of the side of delivery. So there's no change to supply. Government spending on healthcare would be identical in this particular scenario. In that scenario, should the government actually provide the hospital, provide the nurse, or just provide the cash?
Okay, I'm sorry you didn't let me finish the point I was trying to make, which is I think was really important. But let me answer your question then, seeing you're insisting upon it, is that you can try and privatise the delivery of healthcare, and I would agree with you that it would be better if we had a healthcare system provided by vouchers rather than the state choosing. But I don't know whether you saw, the only leaders' debate that we had. You have people promising, Labour Party, SNP, all of them. Well, David Cameron didn't counter it. He didn't promise to put a cap on private sector. But the idea that we could basically privatise the National Health Service in Britain or privatise the commitment to provide healthcare free at the point of use, it's just not saleable. And so you have to begin where the British public is. And at the moment, for whatever reason, and I don't agree with it, the idea that you make profit out of providing healthcare is a no-no. Right. And so a gentle increase in private provision is something I would support, but a revolution of the kind that you're recommending is a non-starter. And I would say what you do need to do is why I support what's pejoratively called the nanny state, but I'd actually describe as the preventative state. If the state can do things that save money from reducing smoking to reducing obesity. That is a reduction in the demand for government that we should support. And I do think that some government interventions on public health are welcome. And that's something that many in the libertarian right have really criticised.
Mm-hmm. And you don't think that can be personalised? I mean, I would be very happy to opt out now from any state funding of any treatment for smoking-related diseases, as long as you took the tobacco tax off my packet of 20. Mm. So I'd be able to buy cigarettes at 60p a packet. I'll then be responsible for my own health.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be, would you? Because you might be, because you're perhaps not the average citizen, Mark. But
I'm only suggesting, I'm not forcing people to opt out. I just want to opt out myself.
But if in 20, 30 years' time you did have lung cancer and you needed health care and you didn't have any money, of course the state would have to provide it. Society wouldn't allow for you not to be.
And you don't think that could be treated like we do with car insurance? That, you know, you've got to buy, if you've got a car, we insist that you buy third-party fire and theft. Again, the government insurance department doesn't sell it to you, we just insist that you buy it. You don't think, intellectually you're minded to go down this route, but you just think it's politically and electorally unsellable at the moment.
Particularly if that insurance provider that you bought into wasn't around in 15, 20 years' time, or it wasn't providing the kind of care that society then thought was a minimum.
Okay. I then wanted, and you might want to return to the point that I very rudely didn't let you finish, Tim.
Well, I've made it in a different way now.
On the size of the state, because this is different. There is a difference between scope and size, and, you know, to some degree, you know, I would probably prefer to live in a society that, say, had a state that was 40% of GDP and all it did was to transfer wealth around, than a state that was 20% of GDP but, you know, executed litter droppers. You know, I mean, it's not just scope is important, but size is important too. And we previously over the last few weeks have had a correspondence about the size of the state, and you mentioned in your opening remarks that you sort of accept my basic, the basic empirical evidence. It's not really my hypothesis that around about 35-36% of GDP is the record of what governments have raised over the past 50 years. Under Labour governments, Conservative governments, majority governments, huge majority governments, minority governments, with a whole plethora of different tax policies. Are you with sort of George Osborne when he indicated we need to get to a 35% state? Do you think that's, in very broad terms, and I'm not pretending that there's an ideologically perfect, percentage to 2 decimal points, but you're round about there, are you, a state of 35% of GDP?
Probably, because I do accept your point that the state can't raise more than about 36 to 38%, and I think that will probably decline. So that is the kind of level we need to go to. But the reason why I don't particularly like that conversation and that way of framing the debate is that less interesting than how we cut the supply of the state is how we produce the kind of citizens that can survive with that sort of state. So I'm much more interested in building a state that helps provide adult citizens who don't need the state quite so much. And so, the biggest, I would say, preventer of a large state is education. So you educate citizens, and if you educate citizens via state education, or that's one way of producing adult citizens. Does the state have a role in helping people to become drug-free? Does it have a role in trying to keep families together? All these sorts of things produce citizens that require less state intervention. The collapse of the family, partly produced by the welfare state, but also by some operations of the labour market. That's one of the biggest ways that the state has grown. Helping produce independent, active citizens should be a large part of answering, going back to Philip's question, as theory of the state.
And don't you think in that, and in fact, reading again through your draft proposals, there was one which was, I think, potentially where there was a lot of common ground between some of the ideas that the IEA, and particularly Christian Niemitz, have come up with on poverty. That if you were looking at, how many people can stand on their own 2 feet, then you should be looking at what is the government doing to increase the general cost of living as opposed to decreasing it. And, if you had enormous supply-side reform on housing, and if you, lowered
the
VAT,
energy market, leave the common agricultural policy.
All of those things. So
agreed.
suddenly, actually earning 10 grand a year as a salary might be more than enough to get by on, rather than it being inconceivable that you could heat your home and even have a home.
Well, that's where I think we are completely in agreement. There are all sorts of state interventions in the farming sector, in the property sector, in the energy sector, which have inflated the cost of living for families, and all of that should be got rid of.
On the sort of morality of this, because you mentioned that there's a problem, whether it's fair or unfair, that the Conservative Party, those on the right, are seen to be the friends of the rich. I'm interested in what your broad moral views are about what the rich should contribute to society through taxation, and to what extent you care about inequality, if at all. So, I mean, Osborne trots out these numbers. I mean, roughly speaking, the top 1% of earners earn about 12% of income and contribute about 27% of income tax. Do you think that's the sweet spot, bang on right, or too progressive, or not flat tax enough? Do you think the rich are pulling their weight? And isn't there a danger that there's sort of a myth has circulated that sort of everybody worth more than £1 million is contributing nothing? Whereas actually the facts are we are hugely dependent on these high earners and their generous, progressive, very high per capita contributions.
Well, it's a very generous contribution from income taxes.
Yep.
It's a not particularly generous contribution if you start looking at wealth, property and consumption. And so I think, and there's a good free market case for taxing income less and property and consumption more. It's been advocated by people like Bill Gates, no less. And so if you look at the overall contribution of wealthy people compared to low income people, and you don't just measure their contribution from their income, but their wider contribution, actually it's nowhere near as progressive as the numbers that you quoted said. I would overall like to cut taxes on income and start taxing the sale of properties and the sale of and the certain purchase of luxury goods more. And I would retilt the tax system. I think that would encourage incentives.
Okay, therefore, if you were to go for a wealth tax, I mean, one moral objection against that.
Not a wealth tax, higher property taxes of various kinds, and also higher consumption
particular
taxes. The stuff the Greens proposing today doesn't make any sense.
No, okay, but my one moral objection is that, okay, I've contributed 40% of my income as a successful, highly successful Premier League footballer or whatever. I've now bought my house with what remains, and you're now coming after my house as well. I mean, of course I've got a decent house. That's what I spent the remainder of my income in that you let me keep, and you now want to go after that wealth as well. I mean, do you have any worries about double, treble, quadruple taxation? I sometimes think the case is overstated. You pay income tax, and then you do pay VAT on what you spend your disposable income on. Yeah. But are you at all worried that you're really going after people 5 times over?
I'm not worried really about the extraordinary property price increases that people get in the UK, not because of the sweat of their own labour or their ingenuity, but because we have a ridiculous property market. We have a property market heavily regulated, we've already touched upon it, and most of the gains that people get from selling those properties are nothing to do with anything that they have done through ingenuity. They're done because we have a rigged property market. The state taking a bit of that back, a bit more of it back, I have no ethical problem with at all.
So, and you'd have a similar tax then presumably on national lottery winners. I mean, that's not an act of productive or ingenious effort to pick 6 numbers between 1 and 49 at random.
I haven't thought about national lottery winners. You're giving me new ideas.
Well, I'm a bit worried about where my poker winnings are going to end up as well. I mean, when is it a matter of ingenuity and when is it good luck? I mean, if you invest in stocks, if you bought Facebook shares or bought into that company or Apple at the low end, and without you doing anything, this company becomes hugely successful, you get a massive.
Well, the huge advantage of property taxes versus, say, internet taxes, we've seen this, the gambling industry goes abroad if you tax it, whereas property it's very hard to hide from the tax man, which makes it's one of the advantages.
But you potentially decide to, Madonna decides rather than living in Mayfair that she'll live in Monte Carlo, for example. I mean, there are effects on particularly the high end of that market. Yeah.
There are, and any tax that is levied at too high a level will always have those sorts.
And why luxury goods? I mean, and again, what is a luxury good? I mean, is my collection of vintage Doctor Who DVDs a luxury or a necessity for an obsessed science fiction fan like myself?
I think if you can afford to pay £10,000 for a crocodile handbag, you can pay a slightly higher percentage of tax, consumption tax, than standard VAT.
But how would you measure this? I mean, I'm just trying to do the numbers. I think my Doctor Who DVD collection is probably worth of that sort of order.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, you really are a Doctor Who fan.
And I haven't moved on to,
That's my biggest learning so far from this segment. Yeah.
and I haven't moved on to my Southampton Football Club programme collection yet.
That's valuable?
Well, I'm clearly going to have to sacrifice one of them to keep your health spending going as you wish it to.
Well, of course, if someone buys an awful lot of a low-value good in massive quantity, then effectively it's the same as a luxury.
1,000 items of jewellery that are worth £1 million in total, as opposed to one item of jewellery.
And you're in the area of practicalities then. How do you capture that? And so there is clearly an injustice in a direct comparison. But you have to have a tax system that is basically workable. And I think taxing £10,000 goods at a slightly different rate, higher rate than taxing Doctor Who DVDs is defensible.
You and Patrick O'Flynn are at one on this.
Well, he was overruled by Nigel. He called it the WAGS tax.
Yeah. I want to finish with a few thoughts about.
Just on that, all taxes are hard to defend. Ideally you don't want this sort of WAGS tax or luxury tax, but the choice is: do you have that tax, or do you tax the income of the low paid?
Or do you cut spending?
Well, you have to cut spending as well, but you will still need to raise a certain amount of tax somehow. And the choice for Conservatives, in particular, is: do we tax luxury goods, or do we tax something else? It's not do we tax luxury goods or do we not tax luxury goods. It's what do you say about your priorities? What you tax, you say an awful lot about your priorities through.
But you're also partly basing it on what you can go after. It's easier to identify someone's house than their car. Yeah. So somebody who's decided to invest a lot in their property but rides a bicycle, you're going to whack. But somebody who lives in a hotel but drives a Lamborghini is probably going to get away with it.
There is no moral distinction between someone spending lots on paintings and necessarily on property. But whereas you can hide your paintings, you can hide your property. So there's a basic practicality question.
I want to finish a bit on the messaging. And I'm just thinking back to your TV piece with the Ronnie Reagan statue and everything. It seems to me, and the world's moved on enormously. I mean, listening to Margaret Thatcher on the Today programme this morning, the archive footage of her defending council house sales, it's a totally different language and narrative than one that could be used in 2015. But it seems to me that in electoral marketing sales terms, Thatcher and Reagan were onto something. They were small state, low tax, saying things like the government is out to get you, the 9 most terrifying words of the English language. They went for the whole lot, and they won. They were enormously successful in that regard. And I want to hear from Barry here, who's a Conservative councillor. So he's one of your doorstep,
I know
chaps
Barry.
who's knocking on doors. Don't you actually think that, rather than this imagery, a rather tougher Thatcherite Reaganite message might actually be one that would resonate in the electorate?
Absolutely, and I should say I'm a councillor who's just been re-elected last year, having moved from a very safe seat to a marginal, and on the doorstep we were pushing a message of basically lowering tax, of actually sort of delivering to those services that people clearly do need, but thinking in a way that actually made sense, trying to live within those sort of means that set out, trying to reduce that size of the state. And on the doorstep we were received well, and bucked the national trend last year in Harrow, North West London, actually gained seats, whereas in West London, and except where you're up against Liberals, Conservatives went backwards. So we gained, and we pushed to that. It seems a message that I think needs to be addressed, is that if you are going to be arguing for this larger state and so on, actually that's not what most people are looking for. It's most people are looking for how this is going to really affect them, that messaging. I think there's a grain of truth in what you're arguing, but there's also needs to be rolled back to thinking, actually, is the tax that people spend, how much is it going to actually deliver for them? And that's the messaging that you need to be looking at, I think, in what you're doing.
What are your thoughts on that? Whether a rather more, if you like, aggressive Thatcherite, Reaganite message? I mean, particularly it seems that UKIP's tapped into some of that sort of language and narrative and has perhaps peeled away people who would, had they been around and similar voters at the time would have been voting for Thatcher.
Well, I don't think. I think UKIP started as a libertarian party, and I think it still advertises it as a non-racist libertarian party. But I don't think it is. You know, it's you look at what's driving its appeal. I think it's very strong state control of immigration. For example, it's promising to spend more on the National Health Service now than at least the Conservatives until a week or so ago. You know, I think it's quite a big state message actually. UKIP, I think it's lost its initial purpose. But to answer Barry's question, and partly where you started, Mark, on Thatcher and Reagan. Look, I believe that we should have lower taxes than Labour. I believe in Euroscepticism. On most things, I would regard myself, believer in marriage, as a pretty cardboard cutout conservative. Most people would, I think, regard me as such as well. And we haven't talked perhaps as much tonight about the common ground as the things that differentiate ourselves. But I do think you need to get into people's, across people's thresholds of their doors, first of all, by showing you have a basic commitment to some things that they regard as really important. And Mrs. Thatcher did do that. So, she never tampered with the National Health Service in any significant way. And right until 1988 did she have the Ken Clarke reforms. She really didn't touch benefits in any serious way until Peter Lilly began his revolution later. She never touched the BBC. You could argue as important to Mrs. Thatcher's appeal was the stuff that she left unchanged as much as the stuff that she did change. Hammersmith and Fulham, I'm not so familiar with Harrow, Barry, forgive me, but Hammersmith and Fulham were cutting, when they were Tory run, they were cutting taxes 3% every year. But alongside that was quite a big investment in policing and education, and Stephen Greenhalgh, if he was here now, would say that was as important to the re-election of Hammersmith and Fulham 5-6 years ago than any of the tax cuts. And he says Tories were very enthusiastic about the tax cuts, but the marginal floating residents needed that assurance that they were committed to the state. So now, I haven't become, in the good right, given up on all sorts of basic conservative principles. I just think sometimes, like Margaret Thatcher, we have to affirm the breadth of what we believe in and not just focus on the few of the anti-state dimensions. And I think one of the greatest problems the conservative movement has got itself into on both sides of the Atlantic is a misremembering of Thatcher and Reagan. Thatcher and Reagan never cut the size of the state, I think, in any year other than one. They protected the state to a very large extent. They weren't as frightening as the Reaganites and Thatcherites that profess now to be the true inheritors of Thatcher and Reagan. Mrs. Thatcher's memoirs, The Path to Power, talk very much about some of her regrets at what the years in the 1980s had unleashed, and she wanted to find roles for reinvigorating the morality of citizens. And that, at the heart, I hope, is what the good right is. How do we build the ideal citizen again, the independent adult? And the conversation, I think the most important conversation we have is, what role, if any, does the state have in that? I think the state has a role. Some perhaps in this room wouldn't, but that seems to me to be one of the most central questions now. How do we rebuild the worker who can provide for himself, herself, and the family? How do we have the educated citizen? How do we have the good parent? And what role does the state do in providing that and helping those things to flourish?
Tim, can I finish by asking you then, I started with the Conservative Manifesto, what do you anticipate the outcome will be on Thursday, May the 7th? If you just say hung Parliament, I'm going to punch you, all right? That's not an adequate enough answer.
Well, I keep... this really is something we should throw over to Stephen Shakespeare, actually, after me, if he's willing, because he's probably wiser at predicting this. He has more information and knowledge. I'm going to cop out a bit, but I'm going to say, if the opinion polls, I'll say it this way, before the last election, I was sure the Tories would win a majority, because we'd had 3 years, basically, of the Tories leading in the opinion polls. The mentality was that David Cameron would become Prime Minister. All of the opinion polls pointed to a hung Parliament, and the opinion polls were right. That feeling we had in the back of our mind was wrong. This time, I think a lot of us have gone into the election thinking the British people can't possibly elect Ed Miliband as Prime Minister. All of the opinion polls are now pointing to the fact that the SNP and the Labour Party will have more seats than the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. I, at the moment, will have to say I'm not prepared intellectually to ignore those opinion polls.
Stefan, who's Tim's colleague at the back, perhaps you can assure us that the opinion polls are indeed right.
Yes, I think.
Or rather terrify us that they're right, depending on the...
I think the opinion polls are correct. They're very consistent. Even the road polls are part of the consistency of the numbers. And there is absolutely nothing in the data that suggests anything other than a Labour victory with the SNP. Now, a lot of us believe there'll be a little bit of a swing, and we have some vague excuses for it. There's nothing at all in the data that justifies any of that.
Well, the rational thing to do, which I'm thinking of doing, is not actually to predict what you think the result will be and bet on it. It is to predict what you think your tax liability will be in the event of an Ed Miliband government and hedge that by betting on him becoming Prime Minister. So that's my approach to gambling and gaming on May the 7th. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Tim, thank you for a fascinating discussion and being willing to come into the friendly Lion's Den for covering a lot of issues. I know that we actually have enormously more shared ground than we've discussed today. We've highlighted some of our intellectual and perhaps marketing differences as well. But it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm incredibly grateful for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tim Montgomerie. Tim, thanks very much.